The sound of the door she slammed shook her as she walked down the porch and out of the house. Her blood boiled with anger. The thoughts in her mind were jumbled up, and as time ticked by, she got angrier with herself. Kaylee could recall the last time she got angry and how she had attempted that same escape, fighting, rushing out of the house, and slamming the door behind her as she went. The end result had left her more traumatized than the initial situation. That fateful evening, she had quarreled with Valerie, one of the kitchen maids back at the former house. Kaylee's mother, Lucy, before the quarrel, had informed the kitchen maids not to cook Kaylee's dinner anymore. Who else but Kaylee to think the decision was unfair and uncalled for? It made no sense that her mother required her to start making her dinner all of a sudden. She was never taught how to cook in her early teenage years. How was she supposed to start cooking? Her father had hired enough maids to take care of her business as always. He possessed enough wealth to purchase whatever he wanted, whatever she wanted, and she never hesitated to use the power that riches had given her. The maids didn't take care of the cooking alone. Ever since her birth, maids have surrounded Kaylee. They were assigned to take care of her business, from her daily care routine to laundry, assignments, and every chore the human mind could think of. She never had to do anything by herself or take care of anything that a maid could. Many times her ears had caught a whiff of tales of how rich people liked to discipline their children at certain points in their lives as they grew. But never in her wildest dreams did Kaylee imagine that her mother would pull off such a stunt on her. She was already 18, and such was not expected to happen. She wished her mother had at least started with something mild. She couldn't understand the stubbornness that made her mother so insistent on her decision. There was no changing her mind. Her father, on the other hand, made no comment. He didn't even try to help her out of the horrible situation. He didn't say anything to her mother either. Even if she didn't say it out loud, Kaylee's heart broke at the extent of their betrayal. Having nothing close to another choice, Kaylee went to the kitchen, hoping she would achieve something by magic or some other powers. She knew she could not order some food because her mother had intercepted every previous trial that she had made. It soon became evident that even magic wouldn't bend in her favor. She could not light the cooker. The thing was more complicated than she had imagined. She turned the knob and twisted the angles. No matter what she did, the gas would not come on. In her frustration, she kicked the cooker, cussed out loud, and hissed. A maid strolled in, the maid she had quarreled with. She outright refused to help her light the stove. Kaylee screamed at her in frustration, kicked the cooker once more, and stormed out of the house, jamming the door behind her. With no destination in mind, she roamed down the neighborhood and would have continued if she didn't see smoke from afar. She turned around and saw people running towards the fire and saying that a fire was burning at the most expensive building in the neighborhood. She didn't need any narration to know that the most expensive house belonged to her parents. As she ran back towards the house, her legs shook. The hurried beating of her heart scared her to death. Her mind roamed in a million directions. She would have flown if she could. She hoped beyond hope that all would be well. The closer she drew to the house, the wider her eyes got, and the broader her understanding of the disaster that loomed. Fire brigade officers trooped in, trying to salvage as much as they could, trying their best to stop the raging fire. Tears welled up in her as she watched the men retrieve burnt bodies from the house. She stood where police officers had formed a barricade, stopping her from entering the house after she identified herself as a daughter of the house. The more the men came in and out, the more she wanted to scream at them to bring out her father and mother. The firefighters had brought the burning to a halt, but too much damage lay in heaps of blackened rubble. She let out a scream a few moments later, louder than she would have a few moments before, because the next body some of the firefighters carried out of the house could be none other than her dad. She was sure because he was the only male figure in the house that night. She ran towards them as her eyes teared up more. "Dad!" She screamed after them until she was in front of her dad. Her hands shook with heaviness when she tried to touch him. She almost couldn't recognize him. "He's dead," she heard one of them say, and she turned her anger on them. "He can't be! He was alive and well when I left the house a couple of minutes ago!" She lashed at them, spewing each word as though it carried life and would raise her father. Not that she believed he was dead, like they proclaimed. They couldn't be right. But the longer she stayed by his side, the more real it seemed. He wasn't breathing. She couldn't shake him or touch him as much as she wanted. Burns covered his entire body. Kaylee wailed. We found him close to the kitchen, where we suspect the fire started. It seems someone turned on the gas and forgot to turn it off. The maid who turned on the stove is the one who encountered the most damage. Of course, she's dead. One of the firefighters who brought her father outside was explaining to someone Kaylee supposed was the boss. She froze in her position, her mind reminiscing on what happened before she left the house. Could it be that she managed to turn the gas on one way or the other, and the fire started because of her? She shook her head again and again, denying the evidence of her involvement. She wanted to scream again when some men came out rushing from the damaged house with someone in a carrier. The person seemed to be alive. Curiosity kicked her possible involvement out of her mind. Or maybe she hoped to find an answer in the person that was being brought to an ambulance as the men screamed that it was an emergency. They came to a stop by the ambulance, and the emergency officers rushed to attend to her. Kaylee was right. Whoever it was, the person was alive. She headed in that direction, leaving her father for a while. The person was her mother. Her mother was screaming in pain as they tried to straighten her leg and help her lie down. Kaylee's heart bled for the second or umpteenth time that day. She got into the ambulance with her mother and held her hands, squeezing her fingers to hide away her shock. Who would have known a lot could happen in the passing of minutes? A moment ago, she took time screaming at her mother for being so cruel, asking her to cook when she didn't learn to do so all her life. The next, she couldn't recognize her house. Her father was dead, and her mother was screaming in honest pain caused by what seemed to be a broken leg. Kaylee didn't know where from, but she overheard that the groans of a woman trapped beneath a broken door led the men to find her mother. The journey to the hospital was long and hopeless for Kaylee. She knew her father was also in another ambulance on the way to a mortuary. She wished that life would take a pause and allow her to swallow the million bitter pills one at a time. Her throat felt parched from endless wailing and screaming. The doctors rushed her mother to the operating theater. No one came out until a few hours later. The news that came with their retreat threw another bomb into Kaylee's world. The one person who managed to survive the fire didn't make it unscathed after all. Her mother, as a result of the fire, lost the use of her legs. Homeless and fatherless, Kaylee started to face her new reality. The reality of how responsibilities had been handed to her overnight. She knew that she needed to cater for her mother, and for the first time in her life, when she left the hospital room that night, she sought a job. She had never done it before in her life, and she didn't have an inkling how she should have done it. They had no one to help them, and Kaylee knew that she now had a lot on her shoulders. The next day, she went back to what used to be a home less than 12 hours before. She sat before the massive ruins and cried. The news about the domestic fire was all over, and the people had concluded it occurred due to a mistake by one of the maids in the kitchen. If no one knew, Kaylee knew that no maid other than herself carried the guilt and blame for the accident that led to the loss of 9 lives and a pair of legs. She wept with so much bitterness, rumbling through the ruins, wondering if she could find any substantial thing to save. But nothing had changed from the report that the firefighters gave. The only thing that escaped the fire was Kaylee's mother, and the thing that saved her was the same thing that took her legs. Kaylee would have died too if she didn't go on that walk. In all honesty, she wished she didn't. Death seemed to be a better option compared to the truckload of tragedies that she got. Storming out of the house of her new boss and jamming the door like she did that day restored all the memory to her head. With calculated steps, Kaylee made her way back into the house. Before her current boss, she had lost jobs in 3 restaurants, 2 bars, and a shopping mall. In all these places, making some income to take care of her invalid mother was her top priority. But she was no match for the duties and manners that all those jobs demanded. Her mother was in her wheelchair waiting for her. For a while, she had forgotten how magnanimous her new boss was. Mrs. Shelby didn't only agree to take her in as a maid, she provided a roof over her head and her mother's, one that was much better than the makeshift rooms that were available in the restaurants she had worked turns at. Mrs. Shelby was generous, but didn't hold back, especially when it came to drilling into Kaylee the energy and zeal she lacked. She got into the house, and her mother was waiting for her. Her mother motioned for her to follow her. Kaylee watched her mother wheel herself toward the room they shared. Rather than following her mother, Kaylee turned towards the kitchen to finish up her duties. She apologized to Mrs. Shelby for her crude behavior before joining her mother in the room. "What took you so long?" her mother asked, avoiding her eyes. "I went back to complete my duties. I was wrong to have left that way," Kaylee replied, while tears found their way to her eyelids. She blinked them away, waiting to hear her mother say something. She sniffed after a while and opened her mouth to speak. "Or maybe I wasn't wrong, Mother. I have never done all these things before. I have never had reason to wash my clothes, do the dishes, cook food, or do any chores of that sort." She inhaled and exhaled, allowing anger to take the place of the vulnerability she felt some moments ago. She couldn't have been wrong in telling her boss that she would do the dishes the next day when she was more relaxed. It was Mrs. Shelby who mounted the wrong horse by being angry and refusing to understand. Mrs. Shelby needed the reprimanding, not her. Her mother always blames her. Couldn't she just take a break? She continued to speak to her mother. "I've been working all day, tending to the animals on the farm, turning the soil in the garden, sweeping, cooking, doing the laundry, and all other meandering jobs. You know, I understand better now why you and Dad hired a lot of maids. I used to think you hired as much as you wanted because you had the money. The workload is too much for one person. What did I do wrong by asking Mrs. Shelby to hire more people? That way the work gets done faster and easier." She paced around the room, pleading her case like it made all the sense in the world. "That way she wouldn't complain because there will be more maids around. I can't do all of them by myself." "You have said enough." The words of her mother halted her steps and sealed her lips. "I didn't know I raised such a spoiled brat. I should have discouraged your father from hiring maids sooner and put you to work faster. Knowing how to take care of a house is basic, Kaylee. It is not so much work or stressful, not the way you think it is." Her mother's eyes glowed with anger, her cheeks flushed with red. Kaylee was sure her mother would have slapped her if she wasn't conditioned to a wheelchair. "If only I sent you to the kitchen when you were much younger, you wouldn't have left the gas on and sent the whole house into flames," her mother hissed. Her eyes boiled, and Kaylee could not recall if she had ever seen her mom look so fierce and dreadful. The color in Kaylee's cheeks drained. Her chest thumped, and its heartbeat doubled in its rate. Her hands shook by her side, watching her mother rip her open with her bare eyes. If anything, Kaylee could never imagine that her mom could ever guess, let alone that she knew, that Kaylee caused the fire that night. "You think I don't know?" her mother continued. "You think I don't know that you were in that kitchen, fumbling with the valves when you tried to turn on the gas? Of course, I know Valerie could never make that mistake, but you turned on the gas without a fire, fought with the poor maid, and stormed out of the house in your usual manner." Sympathy quickly replaced the anger in her mother's eyes. "I know it as much as you do, Kaylee. I know you know that it is your fault the house got burnt to the ground. I know you carry the guilt and burden of the loss of your father and my legs. I know you've been trying to make a living to help me and help yourself, but you're forgetting one thing. You're not learning to let go of your pride. That's what's killing you on the inside, not the guilt, not the loss, but your pride, and those things riches gave you on a platter. They have made you useless, perfectly handicapped." Kaylee's tears flowed without gauge. She sniffed aloud beside her mother. The weakness in her knees causes her to fall to the ground. "Mom," she whispered, "what am I supposed to do?" Let go of your pride and learn, Kaylee. Be responsible for your actions. Take up the consequences of your decisions and face them. Don't act like a brat or like one who needs guidance all through life. Learn to live in plenty and nothing. Does this include doing all this work, Mom? Washing the toilets, mopping the floors, all those things? Her mom nodded, and Kaylee nodded back. She wiped off her tears and stepped out of the room to the back of the house. Her mind sauntered with ease to the first job she secured at a spaghetti restaurant. Her boss fired her because she yelled at a customer to get her order in the kitchen herself. The customer in question couldn't hide her irritation, surprise, and embarrassment at the way Kaylee treated her. Kaylee's boss was so pissed that she sent Kaylee and her mother off that night. Kaylee was so angry, she didn't beg or explain that the customer had been rude to her first. Not that it mattered. Kaylee had given her the attitude too. At the second restaurant, something similar happened. She left work in the middle of her shift because she thought she needed some rest after long hours of tedious work. Her boss thought it was insolence and let her go. At the bars, she was worse. She made the other workers work on her behalf, and when they got fed up, they reported her, and once again, another boss threw her out. She was always fired for either being rude or careless or spoiled. She would have walked out on a perfect job that night, too, if she hadn't thought about the accident that brought her to those shoes in the first place. Perhaps her mother was right. Perhaps she had to let go of her pride and face her reality. She wasn't a child anymore. She was an adult who needed to take bold steps. Maybe she wasn't rich, but she could still make the best of life.